Okay, jumping into our first beer of today's big high ABV, big bold multifaceted Tavour review. We've got Siren Craft Brews 2016 release Maiden. This is a barrel-aged barley wine. Clocks in at 11.2% ABV and they are based out of Wokingham, England. Okay, so this has been aged in 6 different barrels. We've got fresh Maiden gin, Armagnac brandy, Bagnos French aperitif, Heaven Hill Kentucky bourbon, red wine, and rum. So it's just gonna, I can't even imagine what this is gonna taste like. Barley wine is already intense and complex, and then they went through 6 completely different barrels. I don't even know what to expect. But I do know that this specific beer won the 2018 Great British Beer Festival's Supreme Champion Beer of Britain, which is the top honor for beers at that festival. I imagine it's going to be pretty good. You'll notice that this is wax dipped. I don't know, it could be corked. A lot of barley wines are, so I've got that in case I need to pull it. I use this bottle opener this end, but this side is an old school can opener, and the kind of sharp points on these work very well for getting through the wax to get down to the cap to be able to grip and start to pull. So I find if I just get under the natural edge of the cap and just kind of gouge it with this tip, I can normally start to wiggle my way to be able to get the actual cap opener side to catch underneath the rim of the cap. Let's get this cracked. Ooh, yeah. There it goes. Okay, no cork. Oh, has a nice little freshness seal in the top of the cap. This probably is a more pricey cap. I've never seen one quite like that. Had a really nice pop when it popped, almost like it had been corked. Bottle art on this is actually pretty neat. There's kind of a picture of what I presume is the Maiden after the namesake of the beer. Trying to angle it a few different ways just in case. Make sure you can see it, but it looks very, very neat. Let's get this poured. I'm using my stout glass because it works pretty well for barley wines in my experience. And here we go. Yep, pouring it in. This is a classic barley wine appearance. They too tend to be this very caramelly, deep ambery brown in appearance. This is no exception. All right. Got the whole bottle in there. Very effervescent, as they also tend to be. This one is pretty much textbook. It looks very dark. It's cloudy. I can tell you that much. But it looks very much perfectly in the color range. Formed a nice head. Let's give it a sniff. Oh. Oh, yeah. That's classic barley wine. And you can just smell just an abundance of different barrels. All of those different barrels are kind of playing an interesting part in here. And it's mishmashing together. So it's a little challenging on the aroma to pick them all out individually. It just smells like a whole bunch of barrels. You can't really quite pick out distinctly what it is, but that mixes with the classic barley wine aroma. It's got a little boozy edge to it, and it's got a nice rich caramelly back to it. So this very much smells like a classic barley wine does, only it's definitely got a nice influence from all these crazy barrels they decided to put it in. Head's already settled down pretty well, so let's jump in for a sip and see what this one's about. Oh, man. Oh, absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. See, that right there, that's exactly why barley wine is my favorite beer style. Oh, it's unlike any other beer style. It is so layered and complex. It's just absolutely incredible. If you've never had a barley wine, do yourself a favor and seek one out. It's not the easiest beer style to find. Not a lot of brewers brew any regularly. It costs a lot of money to make them. It takes a ton of ingredients to go in and produce one. It takes a lot of time. They tend to be more expensive, so they take a little longer to sell. But it's worth it. Barley wine is absolutely incredible. It's one of the most unique beer styles for my money. I absolutely love them, and this one is just absolutely delicious. Body, it's nice and heavy. I don't want to say it feels as heavy as I anticipated for 11.2%, but it's definitely barley wine heavy. I would say it's medium heavy, on the edge between medium heavy and heavy. So it's mostly appropriate. Maybe it's a little lighter than I anticipated, but it's nice. It's a big barley wine. Mouthfeel, it's very thick. It is thick and viscous. Almost all barley wines are. Occasionally you'll get one that's quite effervescent in the mouth, and it kind of throws off that viscosity, your ability to sense it. But this one's quite thick, even though it was very effervescent. They're so complex, there's no way I could tell you all about this without jumping in for another sip. It may take me one or two, but let's jump in and explore these flavors. You get it in your mouth, you swish it around, and the flavors don't become readily apparent, really, until you swallow. That's not a bad thing because it's a big boom, a surprise when it just hits you. The first thing you get is the slight sweetness, a little bit of a booziness, and there's layering of fruit. It tastes almost like caramelized peaches, like if somebody took brown sugar and culinary torched them or baked them with some sugar on top, such that they caramelized peaches mixed with actual caramel. That's what it tastes like. And it's got that same kind of hint of sweetness to it. It's very rich and almost like a toffee. It's something thick. It reminds me of a deep, rich cobbler or maybe even like a toffee pudding or something like that with caramelized and mixed fruit in there. It's really big and it's intense. And then you get this kind of telltale. This happens with barley wine a lot. I don't know if it's coming from some of the barrels they use for the aging, but there is this kind of grape-like undertone to it. So not only does it share some nomenclature with wine, and we've talked about this in prior episodes, but there are elements of it that put you in mind of a wine, aside from the higher ABVs. It's got a very long finish. The flavors really, really linger. They're very deep. They're very intense. I got to go in for one more sip, see if I can figure out where all the barrels interplay, and then precisely how it blooms after that caramelly fruit intensity. It's very complex. Boom. Fruit, caramel, slight booze, slight sweetness, kind of a wine-like quality grape wine. The rum barrel I'm getting distinctly. The gin kind of gets muddied in the middle. I can get the rum. You can get the rum and the bourbon independently. The bourbon has that kind of whiskey edge, and the rum has that kind of caramelized sugar edge, which pairs well with kind of those caramelized peach flavors that came through. I'm not really getting the gin. The brandy gets a little lost in there too, as does the red wine. But you can tell that there's a lot of different barrels in there, and it's just kind of mishmashing all together. But it tastes absolutely delicious. They're hard to pick out all independently, but they taste fantastic together. Absolutely fantastic together. And after that rush of kind of the peach and the sweetness and the booze and the kind of grape and wine-like quality and the caramel cuts through, that's when the barrels really come into their own, and then they all kind of just meld there. And what you're left with is intense caramel flavor with a boatload of different barrel backs. So it's got this boozy, barrely, caramelly just quality about it from the halfway point all the way to the end. And it lasts quite a long time. It really lingers. Full of caramel and barrel aging. This is a delicious barley wine. I absolutely love it. I am going to take my time sipping on every last drop of this one, come up with my scores, and when we come back, we will get to beer number 2. This is Adroit Theory's Rise of Azathoth, which is an oat wine clocking in at 11% ABV. Okay, so moving on to beer number 2 of today's Tavour. Basically, it's a high ABV beer review, or beer wines, if you want to call them. This is Adroit Theory's Rise of Azathoth. This is an oat wine, so essentially the same thing as a barley wine, only with oats. And yes, it does still have barley in it, but oat is a primary. 11% ABV on this one. Adroit Theory is based out of Purcellville, Virginia. They tend to have very interesting bottle art, and this is no exception. The label on this just looks awesome. I mean, the name of the beer is pretty gnarly, but this label art is really something to behold. And, you know, while the name of it is on the front, in typical fashion, they do have this interesting terminology on the back. This says Ghost 760. So if you care, that's the ghost number on this Adroit Theory. But let's get this one cracked. This will be the very first oat wine I've ever had. I imagine it's going to be quite similar to barley wine. I expect this is going to be very big and complex. Let's get this poured. All right, already pouring it. It looks like a barley wine. Which really nothing in the world of beer pleases me quite as much. So I expect this oat wine is going to be something special. I'm really, really glad I got this. And I always like saving the ones I anticipate will be really amazing. Well, they all are great from Tavour, more or less, but I tend to save the last two for mini shipment for my last review. So this will be a way to go out. Visually, yeah, this very much looks similar to a barley wine. If anything, maybe it's a little bit lighter hue, but not that different really. It's more or less got that same shade. Formed a little bit of a head that'll probably get out of the way. Smelling it, elements of this remind me of a barley wine, but I gotta be honest, it's actually got a lot more of a namesake kind of a wine smell. It does smell kind of winey and grape-like. There's definitely some malt, some caramel undertones. Doesn't smell boozy though. It smells very good. I'm gonna jump in. First sip of oat wine. Let's see what this is like. Oh, that's a big beer. That's a very big beer. Very complex. Absolutely, it is remarkably similar to a barley wine. Okay, so first comments on this beer. While it smelled very wine-like, very grape-like, and just hints of caramel on the nose and no hint of booze, you get it in your mouth, you do taste some booze there. Again, it's not overbearing. For me, it's perfectly in place with a high ABV, 11% ABV beer. And I don't really taste any of that grape-like, wine-like quality at all in the flavor. The caramel does come through quite strongly, and there's a bunch, as to be expected with beers of this type, of deep, rich fruit layering in the mix with the malt bill. So it adds all these extra layers of depth, and they keep playing on one another and playing on one another. This one's going to take me a few dives in to really pinpoint, but first I'm going to jump back in for body and mouthfeel and kind of explore the flavors as I think about the finish, and probably one more sip at least just to make sure I'm not missing anything. The body is not as heavy as you would anticipate. It's on the low end of medium heavy. It doesn't encroach on heavy, which at 11% I did kind of expect. Mouthfeel feels almost identical to barley wine in the mouth, only I can tell you this specific beer, which being an oat wine, I'm not surprised. You start to agitate it on the palate, and it gets ludicrously creamy. I've mentioned this many, many times. Oats, the number one best ingredient you can put in a beer if you want to have a higher than average chance of head creation and retention, and it also adds a depth of silkiness to the mouthfeel. It's very, very nice. It's a very nice beer. It's got a very nice body and mouthfeel, even though it's a little lighter in terms of body. Mouthfeel feels exactly where I expected, but I didn't expect it to get that creamy when I rolled it around the palate. It's very, very enjoyable. It makes it feel quite thick at that point, and it really helps all these flavors linger and stick around the palate so you can pick out what you're tasting. And what you're tasting is really quite delicious. This is a special beer. I'm going to jump in again, see if I can pinpoint this ride of flavors all the way out to the end of the finish for you. It's so good. First, get it in your mouth. It's a mix of caramel and rich fruit. It puts me most in mind of figs. maybe just a hint of raisin, but predominantly figs and probably plums. There's a little plum-like quality in the background. Nice ripe ones with that richer, deep flavor that they can get when they're really, really ripe. Not going bad, but a few days off. So it's at the peak of its flavor intensity. And that mixes with that kind of booziness on the front, and they all kind of meld. And then you get this hodgepodge yet again, and this is very common with barley wines, and I guess with oat wines as well. First one, it's hard for me to take a comparison, but I can draw some corollaries. It does put me in mind again of caramelized fruit or toffee kind of desserts or cobblers, where there's a mix of caramelized sugars and deep rich fruits and just this richness to it. It's very much I don't want to say it's necessarily a dessert style beer. I don't think barley wine is either, though you could certainly enjoy it as such after a nice meal, but it's definitely a sipping beer, and it's got layers upon layers of flavor and complexity to it. This doesn't get quite as intense in terms of intensity of flavor, but it does kind of linger around and kind of hold at its intensity for quite a long time before it starts its decline. It doesn't have a ridiculously long finish, especially comparative to what my expectations were as an oat wine and a high ABV beer, but it's not brief either. I guess I would say comparative to other beers that are similar, like barley wines, it's maybe not quite as long. Comparative to other beers of high ABVs like this, it's not quite as long, but it's certainly not brief. I don't know how much information that actually gives you. I would say the total ride from sip to the end when it finally dissipates out, maybe 20 seconds, which, you know, that's probably average for this range, but certainly above average for your standard beer. Very, very enjoyable. I'm going to jump back in one more time for one more sip just to make sure I'm not missing anything important to tell you. It's really good. This is a great beer. It just gets so creamy. Then bam, that fruit and that caramel, that slight booziness, they all start to mingle in the middle. And they just kind of hold there. They're just kind of mingling. And oh, there's some plum. Oh, there's some fig. Oh, there's some caramel. Oh, there's a little bit of booze underneath. And they just hold. Like 10 seconds, and then it finally starts to peter off. And just a delicate little finish. It just kind of disappears into the ether. It isn't abrupt. It just kind of, you can taste it. It's still there, and then it just wisps away. Fantastic beer. I absolutely love this. First oat wine I've ever had. Remarkably similar to barley wine, and I'm a big fan. I'm going to add this to my list of beers like that I'm going to keep my eyes out for. I've actually never seen an oat wine prior. It's the first one I've ever had. I don't know how common this beer style is, but I'm going to do my best to see if I can find some more, because if this is any indicator what they're like, it's an absolute treat. I'm going to take my time sipping on this one, call it my scores. When we come back, we will get both beers ranked from top to bottom. Okay, now that we've gotten to enjoy both of these beers, we're going to get them ranked, starting with the Siren Craft Brew Maiden 2016 release. This is a barrel-aged barley wine out of Wokingham, England, 11.2% ABV, and it was aged in a blend of 6 different barrels. We've got fresh Maiden gin, Armagnac brandy, Beniols French aperitif, Heaven Hill Kentucky bourbon, red wine, and rum barrels. So a very eclectic mix. And this was the winner of the 2018 Great British Beer Fest Supreme Champion Beer of Britain. So a mighty title for a coveted award indeed. Let's see how it fared. Starting with the aroma, this was classic barley wine. And you could pick up a fair bit of the barrels that they used in here, but it got a little muddled. I think honestly there were just so many, it was hard for all of them to have their own voice. Not necessarily a bad thing, but I would have liked to pick out a few more than what actually came through on the aroma. Fairly pronounced for the style, certainly above average. It gets an 8 out of 10. For the taste, I thought this was a very, very enjoyable beer, a very nice barley wine. This is a top tier barley wine to be certain. There's a lot of activity happening with these barrels, and it added tons of different flavor elements into the beer. Really, for me though, I think maybe the barrel route might have been overkill. If you're going to take the time to use all these different barrels, I would like to be able to pick out, at least to some degree, somewhere in the aroma or the flavor, or ideally a combination of both. I didn't get that. It was still very enjoyable, but I would have liked to be able to pick up all the elements they took the time to add in there. I docked 1 point, it gets a 9 out of 10. For the body, it was a big body indeed. It's an 11.2% ABV on a barley wine, though it wasn't actually as heavy as I anticipated. It was very, very close to being upper echelon for that range, but it missed the mark for me just slightly. I docked 1 point there as well. It gets a 9 out of 10. For the mouthfeel, this was textbook barley wine. I wouldn't change a thing. It was perfect. It gets a 10 out of 10. Finish on this was very, very, very long. Each sip lasted a very long time, and it just kept melding with different layers of flavor and barrel accents coming through and remixing with the yeast and the malt bill. It was really quite an incredible ride. Very long finish and classic barley wine. Gets a 10 out of 10. Head and retention, exactly what I expected for a barley wine. It was perfect. It gets a 10 out of 10. Appearance-wise, same thing. This was textbook barley wine. It gets a 10 out of 10. Balance. I really enjoyed the balance on this beer. Now, I did nitpick a couple categories, specifically in terms of the barrel. And I could make an argument that it should lose some points here because I couldn't detect some of the barrels they used in aroma or flavor or both. But frankly, the barley wine itself was so solid that I kind of looked at those as an added bonus in terms of the balance. And frankly, for what it was exceptionally well balanced. I give it a 10 out of 10. Feeling intangible, I loved it. Well, what can I say? I love barley wine. It's my favorite beer style. And a well-made one is just a thing to behold. There's not that many of them out there. Anytime you can get your hands on it, it's always an experience. And this was one of the better ones, certainly, that I've had. It gets a 10 out of 10. Finally, as an example of this style, I teeter-tottered on this category because, frankly, it's an exceptional barley wine. It won a coveted award, and rightfully so. But for me, where I did dock the points on this, I really thought on that long and hard, and I come back to the barrels. If you're going to take the time to use all of these barrels, and they're not going to come through in all their elements somewhere in the flavor or the aroma profile, I'm not really sure what the point is. And certainly it takes longer to produce, and it certainly drives up the cost of the beer. There's an added cost to doing that. So I'm not sure as though you're really getting your money's worth out of it in that extent. To the extent that it was a great, very enjoyable, excellent, well-made barley wine, yes. But taking the barrels into consideration, I would question it. For me, I did decide to dock 1 point, just 1 point, because frankly the beer was spectacular. But it gets a 9 out of 10 as an example of the style, bringing the total score on Siren Craft Brew's Maiden 2016 to a 95 out of 100. So even with the nitpicking I did, it only lost 5 total points. Make no mistake, this is a top tier, exceptional barley wine. If you're a fan of the style, it's one you don't want to miss. It's pricey, but I do think it's worth it. Moving on to beer number 2, the venerable Adroit Theory out of Purcellville, Virginia. This is the Rise of Azathoth Oatwine. 11% ABV on this one, so just 0.2% lower than the prior. Now, I mentioned this when I was drinking the beer. I had never had an oat wine prior, but it's essentially a barley wine that's been brewed with oats. It still has barley, but oat is kind of the primary. So it's a big, complex, high ABV beer with oats as the primary versus barley. This beer was very interesting, and I had some difficult decisions to make when rating this because I didn't really have a point of reference. So on some of these, I tried to give the benefit of the doubt, but at least I have a good reference point for future if I can ever find one. It's the first one I've ever seen. And I would presume these would be where one would find barley wines when you're shopping for them, and I've never seen one. And I enjoyed it. So let's go through the ratings. Gets an 8 out of 10 for the aroma. Same reason as the prior. These are big beers. They're very aromatic. You don't have to breathe in that deeply. You can smell them from a good distance, and when you do get right over the glass, it's just big, bold layers of complexity. That said, neither of these were top upper echelon pungency that I expected for these beer styles or the ABV, but they smelled fantastic and they were still well above average. So that 8 it does get, and well deserved. Taste, I really enjoyed this beer. I did. I thought it was very, very nice, though in terms of complexity compared to the Barleywine, it wasn't quite there. It was still very enjoyable, shared a lot of similar elements, but it didn't have quite that same level of complexity. Don't get me wrong, it was a complex beer, just not quite as complex as the Barleywine that I compared it to prior, and also the intensity of the flavor wasn't as bold. It was kind of an interesting beer drinking experience because there was so much about it that reminded me of other stuff, but first time I'm having it, I was really having to think, but I only docked 1 point. I give it a 9. For the body on this one surprised me. 11%, I really expected it to be quite large, and frankly, I thought it was average. I thought it was high end of average, but it wasn't anywhere near as large as I anticipated. I gave it a 6 out of 10. Mouthfeel, it was essentially identical to the Barleywine, with the exception that if you started to agitate it around the palate, it got ridiculously creamy, and that made it really thicken up as it rolled around, and it was absolutely lovely. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. Finish. The finish on each sip of this beer was pretty long, and it was kind of an interesting ride. You know, all the flavors kind of built and opened up and made their presence known, but they never really had a crazy intense peak. They kind of all melded there, got to the peak of intensity, held it for quite a long time, and it just kind of slowly drifted away. So the way that it presented its finish on each sip was kind of unique. I can't think of another beer I've ever had that the flavor profile finishes like that. It was enjoyable, but because it never really peaked in intensity, it didn't get quite as much length out of each sip. I still thought it was above average. I gave it a 7. Head and retention, I rated it just like I would a Barleywine. I called it perfection. I have a baseline now. It gets a 10 out of 10. Appearance-wise, this was a nice looking beer. Again, I expected that this would be similar to a Barleywine. It did look quite similar, though frankly this was quite a bit lighter in appearance. I don't know if oat wines are typically that many shades lighter than their Barleywine counterparts. So I took it with a grain of salt. I only docked 1 point. I gave it a 9. There's my baseline. Balance on this, I thought it was a very well balanced beer. For me, I would have liked a little more interplay with the complexities that can interweave between the malt bill and the yeast bill. There was a lot of interesting flavor and indeed even aroma elements, but it wasn't quite as complex as, say, a Barleywine. I did enjoy it. Again, here's my baseline. I thought it was above average. I give it an 8. Feeling in the intangible. I really enjoyed this beer. First time ever having this beer style, certainly the first oat wine I've ever had from Adroit Theory by default, and they do a good job brewing their beers. They're clearly thinking outside the box, and it's clear that they put a lot of thought and effort into the beers they release. I thought this was a great one. Again, I have no baseline for where to go, but subjectively, I really enjoyed it. I give it above average. I gave it an 8 out of 10. Finally, as an example of the style. Same thing here. Really have no reference point at all, but I'm basing it off of it's closely related to a Barleywine. So there were many elements about this that were essentially identical, and there were some deviations. Overall, I did dock some points in a few categories, and a lot of them really didn't matter that much. Some of them were bigger deals than the others. But again, I took everything with a grain of salt, and I'm using this as my baseline, and I did think overall it was above average. Even if this were a Barleywine and not an oat wine. If I rated it as a Barleywine, I would still think the same thing. Above average, it gets an 8 out of 10, which brings the total score on Adroit Theory's Rise of Azathoth to an 83 out of 100. So all total, we're only looking at a 12-point spread here. Both of these beers certainly well above average. If you're a fan of Barleywines, I highly recommend this. If you've never had an oat wine and you get your hands on it, I highly recommend this. They were both very, very enjoyable. A lot of similar qualities, and certainly they have their differences, which frankly makes the world of beer drinking that much more interesting. Folks, as always, I sincerely appreciate you tuning in. Please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe if you haven't already done so. And if you want to keep in the loop when our videos go live to YouTube, you can click the notification bell icon. It's right next to the subscribe button. Till next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.